All right, what's going on, everyone? So I'm just back from the NATO summit in Washington, D.C. that wrapped up yesterday. We're going to do a full video on that sometime next week, more of a deep dive, getting into some behind the scenes as well as some one-on-one interviews, asking your questions of General Ryder from the Pentagon, National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby, and then retired General Ben Hodges. But today I want to get into some updates around the war in Ukraine because quite a bit happened in the last couple days since I last updated here. We're going to talk about a missile strike in Kyiv as well as some misinformation, disinformation that came out immediately thereafter that has since been debunked. So we'll provide all the sources for that. We are going to talk high level about some takeaways from the NATO summit. Look at a new U.S. aid package that was just released related to some of those things that came up at the summit. And then Michael Kofman rolled out a pretty lengthy summary of his takeaways from the current situation on the front lines in Ukraine that I think are worth running through really point by point. Now, getting started, jumping into this strike in Kyiv, a Russian missile strike on Monday hit multiple targets throughout Kyiv, including a children's hospital. So the strike resulted in at least 41 civilian deaths and more than 170 wounded, according to Ukrainian President Zelensky. Now, Ukrainian sources say they were able to shoot down 30 of the 38 missiles that were inbound in the skies overhead. But of course, those 8, and then likely some that were shot down, still impacted on the ground and caused pretty considerable damage. Now, in the immediate aftermath of this strike, there were people coming out immediately saying these were interceptor missiles that came down and caused this destruction, especially around the children's hospital. And it looks like at this point, all evidence points to this actually being a Russian Kh-101 cruise missile. So looking at Bellingcat, an online investigative source here, they put together a long rundown that I'll link in the description below if you want to check it out in its entirety. But I'm going to run through what I think are some of the key points here. They say an analysis conducted by Bellingcat using social media footage as well as 3D models of the missile all point to the munition being a Russian Kh-101 cruise missile. The analysis is in line with the view of experts including Fabian Hoffman, a doctoral research fellow at the University of Oslo who specializes in missile technology, and Dr. Jeffrey Lewis, a nuclear weapons and missile expert at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey in California, similarly concluded in an email to Bellingcat that a Kh-101 missile could be seen in footage of the attack posted to social media sites. Bellingcat actually went down kind of a different theory as well, trying to prove that it was an AIM-120 interceptor from a Patriot, but they found no evidence from that at all. So in the immediate aftermath of this strike, as the bodies are still being pulled from the rubble, Ukraine is still trying to identify the extent of the damage caused. There were some pretty large accounts on social media floating these theories that it was Ukrainian interceptor missiles falling into, especially the children's hospital, causing this damage and destruction. A couple keynotes to think about whenever you see this, because the challenge here, of course, is these outrageous claims get a lot of attention right away, and then this, follow-up by Bellingcat that we'll go into more deeply here. Nobody anywhere near as many people look at that, and it takes a while to compile all this information to accurately explain what happened. It takes no time to make something up that drives a lot of attention, unfortunately. Of course, that's nothing new to the internet. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you see these interceptors do fall back down, often they self-detonate if they miss their target. It is possible, however, that missile interceptors do fall back to Earth and impact somewhere, right? Bullets come back to Earth. All these things come back down. So it is a possibility, something to keep in mind when you see this claim of it's likely caused by an interceptor, whether it was here or whether it was down in Crimea when the beach was hit by what appears to be a wayward ATACMS. There were also claims that must have been an interceptor that fell. And look, interceptors don't have very much explosive capacity at baseline. It's a relatively small charge, all things considered. There is fuel in the interceptors, but it often burns out in the first few moments of the flight. So when you see extensive damage or major detonations, it's very, very, very unlikely that that's an interceptor type missile. Now, again, one of the big claims that came out here was from someone on the internet named Jackson Hinkle saying that it was a Patriot AIM-120, and Bellingcat took some of those pictures right there that were used in these claims saying that it was an interceptor missile, and they put this right here side by side, saying left and right, 3D models created by Bellingcat of a Kh-101 and an AIM-120, respectively. In the center is a screenshot from a video showing the missile that hit the hospital. They say, note the features of the missile that hit the hospital closely match those of the Kh-101, but not at all of the AIM-120. IM-120. They say the missile exhibits several characteristics, including the presence of what appears to be a jet engine at the rear, as well as two short wings near the middle of the missile. These are distinct features of the Kh-101, a cruise missile used exclusively by the Russian armed forces. A comparison of a screenshot to the missile that hit the hospital with a 3D rendering of the Kh-101 missile shows that the two indeed share these features. And it wasn't just imagery like this that conclusively, in my opinion, pointed to a Russian cruise missile. But in the immediate aftermath of the strike, the Ukrainian SBU released 3 images claiming to show remnants of the munition that hit the hospital. They stated that the preliminary findings indicated it was a Kh-101, which appears to line up now with the additional information we have. And they lined up what they had, these Kh-101 remnants, with previous Kh-101 strikes all across Ukraine. So there's analysis done on site after every one of these blasts. And no matter how big the bomb is, there's going to be something that remains, some piece of that munition from the missile, the bomb, the rocket, the mortar, whatever, that remains. It doesn't just disintegrate, right? So even the smallest little component can often be identified. And in this case, there's multiple, pieces of this missile still on the ground that match previous Kh-101 strikes. To me, again, all of the evidence seems to point towards a Kh-101 missile. Now, turning to the NATO summit, again, I want to stay pretty high level here and just hit some key points that came out in the immediate aftermath. So there was some thought, albeit in the 1% range, that Ukraine would be offered NATO membership at the summit. That really was not in the cards. There was no realistic way that was going to happen, right? I understand how some people were hoping that would be the case. That wasn't on the table, never really appeared to be. However, they did put out a statement, NATO allies did put out a statement saying that Ukraine is on an irreversible path to NATO membership and pledged to maintain a baseline of $43 billion in annual support to Kyiv as it defends itself from the Russian invasion. Now, I hate this to a degree, having to kind of parse between the words of, they said irreversible path. What does that mean? It's actually kind of a step forward, and all these, there's no real metric on all of this. That is a step shy of guaranteed, right? So they're saying at one point it was Ukraine is headed towards NATO membership or is on the path to NATO membership. Now the words are it's an irreversible path, as in it is definitely going to happen at some point, but again, somehow stopping short of using the word guaranteed or inevitable. Look, I hate having to kind of parse through the language like that, but that's the nature of a lot of this stuff when we're looking at it. Now, there were new pledges that came out of the NATO summit as well, a lot around air defense, Patriot missile systems, and F-16s, as well as promises that individual security deals being signed by NATO members with Ukraine constitute, again, a bridge to NATO. So really kind of pushing this idea that NATO membership is the future for Ukraine. They say as a part of that bridge, NATO agreed to start a new program to provide reliable military aid and training to Ukraine to help it get ready to join the alliance. They said, quote, Ukraine's future is in NATO in a joint communication put out on Wednesday. That wasn't the only thing that came out of the big thing that came out of this summit. They also really kind of called out Beijing, China, for their support of Russia, saying they have an indirect role in this war. And it's the strongest language we've really seen to date directed at China. Again, in a communication put together jointly by the allies, they said China is a decisive enabler of Russia's war effort, saying Chinese investments and exports of dual-use items are rebuilding Russia's defense industrial sector that is helping Russia to overcome Western sanctions to ramp up the production of weapons for use in Ukraine. It's been pretty well known that China has assisted the Russian economy for quite a while now, especially since these sanctions went into place. In terms of Chinese military equipment arriving on the battlefield, we really haven't seen that at all. There's been speculation throughout the war that could happen. Really not seeing that. The thing that we are seeing are these components that Russia has a hard time getting now from the West. They are able to find dual-use components that aren't necessarily sanctioned per se. They buy those from China. And the argument here that I think is valid is that China knows full and well what those are going to be used for. They end up in missiles, aircraft, things like that are then used to continue to conduct the war in Ukraine. Now, just yesterday, the United States announced a new aid package to Ukraine. A couple key items here. Patriot battery, another Patriot battery, NASAMS interceptors, so air defense interceptors, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, HIMARS rockets, artillery ammunition, TOW missiles, Javelins and AT-4s, and then small arms, demolitions, and spare parts. So kind of big ticket items, if you will. The Patriot battery, a whole other Patriot battery showing up to Ukraine is a big deal. And a lot of this you'll see is focused on air defense. I asked that question specifically of General Ryder one-on-one at the Pentagon a couple days ago. I'm going to save that for the follow-up video here, kind of diving into the overall summit, but kind of highlighting that it seems like everything from NATO communications to this new aid package to what's coming here, Michael Kofman's assessment, is focused around air defense, which is interesting. There's a couple different ways to read into that. But I do want to get into Kofman's assessment here. Again, I personally think he's an incredible analyst. He's been covering this war. He's not overly optimistic at times. I feel like if you go back and dig through his work, it's been rather balanced. I think he's hopeful in a lot of ways. He's certainly he's pro-Ukrainian. He wants to see Ukraine win this war. But I don't think he's a cheerleader, if that makes sense. He's not saying things just to say things because it'll sound good to the right audience. And in getting to this assessment, he calls out some things that are going to be real challenges for Ukraine in the coming months as this war drags on. Again, I'll link this full thread in the description below, but I'm going to run through most of it here with some additional context as we go. He says, Ukraine faces difficult months of fighting ahead, but the situation at the front is better than it was this spring. More worrisome is the state of Ukraine's air defense and the damage from Russian strikes to the power grid. Ukraine's manpower, fortifications, and ammunition situation is steadily improving. Russian forces are advancing in Donetsk and are likely to make further gains. So there you have Kofman saying that the situation in a lot of ways is better for Ukraine now than it was just a few months ago. However, we should still expect to see Russian gains on the battlefield over the coming months. Now, I'm going to pull up a map here. This is Deep State Map, publicly available resource, to give an idea of a couple of the areas where he says that Russia is focusing right now. He says in Kyiv, the front has stabilized, with the overall correlation of forces not favorable to Moscow there. And Kyiv is this northern area in the northeastern portion of the country, these two red areas where Russia kicked off a small offensive of sorts a little over a month ago. And again, when looking at this map, the green area is territory once occupied by Russia, since liberated by Ukraine. The red territory are new Russian gains since 2022. When you come down here, the purple in portions of the Donbass as well as Crimea, that is territory annexed and taken by Russia back in 2014. So again, the Kharkiv front up here in the northeastern portion of the country, according to Kofman, has stabilized, and that tends to fit with recent assessments coming out of both Russia and Ukraine. Then moving a little bit south, he says Russian operations are focused on the following directions. Chasiv Yar, and we're going to be zooming in here to the eastern portion of Ukraine. Chasiv Yar, just west of Bakhmut. There's, of course, been a lot of fighting there that we've covered recently. Toretsk, which coming down a little bit further, this is in the vicinity of New York. We talked about that in a recent video. Pretty significant Russian gain here as they moved apparently through some tunnel networks to kind of pop up behind Ukrainian forces. But Toretsk here in the middle of the screen is another focus area. He says, I'm going to mispronounce this, my apologies, Oshatin and Pokrovsk, which is this area over here, just a little bit west, looking west of kind of the Avdiivka area. So in this direction here we go, Oshatin, and then Pokrovsk right here. So in this direction here. And then the last one, he says Kupiansk is actually seeing a bit of a Russian advance as well, or Russian focus, I should say as well, which is a little bit up here further north. There's been a lot of fighting along this front near Kupiansk, not a lot of advance by Russian forces in quite a while, but nonetheless, according to Kofman, if we're kind of zooming out on the map, we've got Kupiansk here, a little bit further south, we've got Chasiv Yar, make sure I got that right there, yeah, Chasiv Yar, and then further south, the Toretsk, New York area, and then west of Avdiivka up here. So according to Kofman, those are the kind of the key areas that Russia is focusing on right now. He says, despite the improved outlook, rectifying manpower deficits will take time. Russian forces are likely to keep advancing over the coming months, especially in Donetsk. The next 2 months will be especially difficult. Addressing manpower gaps remains a priority for Ukraine, but the leading problem is increasingly air defense, both short-range systems to cover the front line and long-range air defense to defend cities, critical infrastructure, and rear areas. And this is an interesting aspect. We just talked about this related to F-16s arriving, which Secretary Blinken said at the NATO summit in kind of the opening remarks, the transfers are underway, and we should expect to see F-16s in the skies over Ukraine this summer. Now, it's kind of the middle of summer, arguably towards the back half of summer, so that generally means sometime in the next couple weeks, there should be F-16s flying over Ukraine. What they need is to be able to protect those aircraft when they're on the ground, because we've seen a lot of Russian strikes against Ukrainian aircraft parked pretty deep inside their own territory. Air defense is a major aspect. Those F-16s aren't going to do much if they're destroyed on the ground. So Ukraine needs more Patriot systems or NASAMS or other air defense assets to be able to protect those airfields that, those air defense systems are currently being used elsewhere. And now they're going to have to be relocated if those F-16s are to be used in any sort of effective manner. He says Ukraine is very low on ammunition for legacy Soviet systems, whereas Russian drone and missile production rates have increased significantly. A deficit of air defense has led to pervasive Russian UAS reconnaissance behind the front lines and increased success rate in strikes. And we've seen countless videos in the last few months showing just this, right? How many videos have you seen? It's been so many more in recent months and throughout the rest of the war where we see relatively clear drone footage and then a strike carried out against a Ukrainian airfield, maybe an air defense system, HIMARS launcher, M270. Potentially, there was one that kind of drove. You saw it on the road, and then you saw something else driving. Either way, there's clear UAS footage overhead deep inside of Ukrainian territory. That's a major change. They traditionally have not been able to get that far behind the front lines. They have in recent months, and what Kofman's pointing to here, shouldn't be a shock for anybody following this, is a significant deficit in air defense to shoot down those drones. He says Russian glide bombs, the UMPK kits, have become more accurate and from greater ranges. They destroy entire positions and are psychologically more impactful than artillery. Glide bombs level structures in cities that would take days of artillery fire to destroy. That's something we have to keep an eye on, because if we look at areas like Bakhmut specifically, where Russia, or not, just as one example of many, where Russia spent days, weeks, months leveling the battlefield with artillery before the infantry was able to advance across those ruins. Now that the fighting positions have been destroyed, according to Kofman, one glide bomb is going to do that same thing. That has the possibility, if Russia is able to exploit it, of opening some gaps in the line to where there could be some sort of breakthrough in the future that we really haven't seen in the past. Again, if one bomb can do what weeks of artillery can do, and Russia flies, 5, 6, 7 sorties over an area in a short period of time, that could really open up some holes in the Ukrainian defense. He says the promise of additional Patriot batteries, NASAMS, and Hawk air defense system, plus rerouting of missile exports to Ukraine can make a difference this year. That said, pushing Patriot batteries forward to tackle Russian airstrikes will be risky if they themselves cannot be defended. This is one of those complicated things in war. You think that you put an air defense system somewhere and it protects the air, but the Patriot is not going to be shooting down some of the smaller Russian drones. It's not going to be able to intercept Russian artillery. All right, so the closer you push those Patriots to the front to shoot down the Russian aircraft that are dropping these glide bombs from far behind the front lines, it exposes those incredibly sensitive and valuable systems to short-range strikes by Russian forces. So then you need to have some sort of short-range air defense asset nearby and things that maybe can intercept artillery or mortars, right? The things that are a little harder for kind of these larger scale, even short-range air defense systems to engage. So there's a real risk with moving those Patriots forward, but that seems to be needed in order to prevent some of these glide bomb strikes from occurring. He says Western munitions have reduced the fire's disparity. At Kharkiv, there's a relative parity of 1-to-1. Elsewhere, 5-to-1 and declining. Though there are still issues with having the right charges, forcing Ukrainian artillery to fire closer to the front line. So when artillery fires, it's not just a big bullet that you put in there and you push the button and it goes. There's powder charges, and depending on how many charges you put in, the round will go further or shorter. So if he's saying they have to fire closer to the front lines, that means that there's a shortage of powder. And it's not, for most systems, it's not just like piling one on top of the other. They're specifically broken out. So you would fire a charge 8. And if you fired a charge 6, you couldn't take the 2 left over and put those on top of a 6 to make an 8, if that makes sense. It's kind of a interesting system, but nonetheless, it looks like there's a shortage in the actual charges being used right now, less than the bullets, than the rounds coming out of the howitzer. He says after the passage of new mobilization laws, Ukraine's first month of increased mobilization shows significantly higher intake of men. There is a lag effect, however. Mobilized personnel need to receive training before they're available to refill formations. The West must also come through with equipment packages to replace losses and kit out new units. Otherwise, there will be mostly infantry, or at best motorized brigades. Ukrainian units need more Mike 113s, armored personnel carriers, Bradleys, and basic protected mobility. That is a very similar conversation we heard before the kickoff of Ukrainians' offensive, counteroffensive, whatever you want to call it, a little over a year ago, was protected mobility. That there's a shortage of that then, and it sounds like there is still, to a degree, a shortage of that. It takes a lot, right? That's You need a lot of APCs to move a battalion, to move a brigade. So as the Ukrainian military ramps up in size, there's a lot of additional equipment needed, armored mobility equipment needed to move them around the front. He says Russian forces alternate between mechanized light vehicle and dismounted infantry attacks depending on the availability of equipment. Some units increasingly employ motorcycles and ATVs. This is partly due to reduced equipment to reduce equipment losses, but also due to a general inability to overcome traditional prepared defenses covered by pervasive reconnaissance and strike munitions. We have seen that a lot more motorcycle platoons taking part in this war. And there's times we've seen some footage come out where there's like 50 motorcycles piled up in a small area because they all got killed really quickly. It's one of these cycles of innovation. I think both sides are trying to figure out ways to do something they're not finding a lot of success. And for the Russians, breaking through the line. So they're trying all sorts of different methods to figure out how to do that. They say Kofman says these tactics can yield incremental gains, but they are poorly suited to achieving operationally significant breakthroughs. Larger assaults have proven costly to Russian forces, which cannot afford sustained equipment losses of the kind seen earlier at Avdiivka. Avdiivka, a while ago, was just assault after assault after assault of tanks, armored personnel carriers, and just constantly getting destroyed. And it's kind of a double-edged sword here. On the one hand, we see that Russia is willing to sacrifice that much equipment for relatively small gains at times. It compounds over weeks and months to be, 10, 20 kilometers, but they'll lose 2, 3, 4, a dozen tanks to gain 50 meters. And what Kofman's getting at is, on the one hand, it's interesting that Russia has that capacity to still do that this far into the war. However, that is not something they can continue on indefinitely. He says the main challenge for Ukraine moving forward is Russia's strike campaign. While Shahed-type drones have become increasingly easy to intercept, Russian airstrikes have become more sophisticated, and Russian missile production rates have notably increased compared with 2022. Russia's not out of missiles. They're not out of drones. They haven't run out of either one of those. And I think something that's easy to overlook in a lot of these airstrike campaigns, these missile strikes, is it's not just Russia pushing a couple buttons, designating a target, pushing a couple buttons, and seeing what happens. They're layering how these different munitions are coming into Ukraine in order to try to achieve the most likely impacts on target, right? So that might be 15 drones sent out early, and then right when those are over Ukrainian cities, KH-101s are launched from multiple directions. Maybe Iskanders join in at various times, and it, based off of the target and the time and the location, like there's a lot that goes into how Russia is adapting these missile strikes, and they're learning. Every one of these missions that are carried out, they see what is shot down, they see what is able to impact the target, what misses and strikes another target nearby, and every single time they're adjusting course and finding out what they can do differently to affect the battlefields in Ukraine. So they're learning, and they have plenty of munitions still available to continue to adapt as the war goes on. But again, I'll link that entire Kofman assessment in the description below. I think there's a really good run through and worth reading start to finish, although we did cover quite a bit of it here. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if you're interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, which is linked in the description below. It's our reader-funded publication, kind of a mix between a newsletter and a website. You can sign up and get these emails direct to your inbox 3 times a week when we put out new articles. Coming up on 10,000 subscribers, so we're actually reaching a pretty solid audience there, reading these things every day, and I think they're valuable. I think they're interesting. But again, that's in the description if interested. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.